Yes. So good morning, everyone, or good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to week 6 of the IES seminar series. The title of today's presentation is Strategies for Building Resilience to Climate Change in Caribbean Small Island Developing States. And the speaker or presenter is Dr. Roger Pulwarty. I hope I said that correctly. Dr. Roger Pulwarty is a senior scientist in the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration NOAA Physical Sciences Laboratory in Colorado, USA, as well as professor adjunct at University of Colorado and the University of the West Indies. He was previously the senior science advisor for climate and the director of the National Integrated Drought Information System, NIDIS, in the NOAA Climate Program Office. He has several publications focused on climate science, risk management, and information services in the US, Latin America, and the Caribbean, and is the lead author on the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction Global Assessment Reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, special reports on water resources and on extreme events, and the IPCC Working Group 2 Impacts, Adaptation and Vulnerability, as well as the US National Climate Assessment. Roger has designed and led widely recognized programs dealing with climate science and services, such as NIDIS, the JEF Mainstreaming Adaptation to Climate Change Project in the Caribbean, and the Inter-American Institute Collaborative Research Network on Eastern Pacific boundary currents. Roger has served on several scientific committees, provided testimonies before the US Congress, and acts as an advisor on climate risk management and services to several organizations, including Western Governors Association, the Caribbean Economic Community, European Union, the Organization of American States, OECD, International Federation of Red Cross, UNDP, UNCCD, UNEP, and the Inter-American and World Banks. He co-chairs the World Meteorological Organization, WMO, Climate Services Information System, and the UN Sustainable Development Goal 6 Water, the US chapter. And he's a member of several boards and professional committees, including the Steering Committee of the Global Climate Observing System, and the White House Task Force on the Water, Energy, Food Nexus, and on Climate and National Security. Roger is the recipient of multiple awards for his work, and his work on integrating science into decision-making has been featured in several media communications, such as the New York Times, National Geographic, Forbes, and the BBC. Dr. Pulwarty, welcome. You have 45 minutes for your presentation, and after your presentation, we will have a 10 to 15 minutes for questions.
Great. Thank you very much. Greatly appreciated, and thanks for taking the time, everyone. So one thing should be mentioned, I'm also from Trinidad, as you might pick up from my accent. Some people who are on the call would pick that up. So let me just share my screen, and then we can go from there. See how this is working. All right, so yeah, my name's Roger Pulwarty. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, some may know, some may not, actually maps everything from solar flares affecting communications down to manganese nodules on the ocean floor and everything in between. I'm a climate scientist, but I also work very heavily on how that information gets used in practice. So I shortened the title, but it is, as was just described, clearly change and resilience in the Caribbean. Now, we know that change is ahead. As I like to say, you don't need to be the Dalai Lama to know that change is ahead, but the question is what kind and what do we do about it? And so there are a lot of institutes that we work with, the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, which I'll mention their work, the Caribbean Community Climate Change Center, the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Authority, University of the West Indies, both in Cave Hill and in Mona, Jamaica, and a whole lot of others around the Caribbean region and outside of the region that work on issues surrounding climate and resilience in this area. So the question for us here is, who is at risk? What is at risk? What is being done and what can be done about it? And at the top of all of that is, what is the nature of the risk? And so I want to get to some of that, and you'll hear some of those in the ensuing talks that people will have. So no matter what, in the US National Climate Assessment of the Caribbean and Pacific Islands, islands in general, so mounting threats to food and water security, infrastructure, public health and safety are expected to lead to increasing movement from high to low elevation islands, continental sites, making it difficult for islanders to sustain the region's unique customs, beliefs, and languages. Now, it's a strongly risk-based statement. We're going to ask the question, does it have to be that way? As we like to say, geography is not destiny. And so let's think through how we might in fact move ahead of these and what is being done in the region. So the Caribbean, 44 million people, about 12,000 species, 10% of the world's coral reefs, 12% of the mangroves. And as we think through this, and this was an image we used when I was on the fourth assessment report of the IPCC on islands, there are impacts on morphology, the types of things that the people who are on this call and others work on, impacts on ecosystems and natural resources, coral reefs and so on, impacts on island livelihoods. All of these can be used to produce indicators and trends, but indicators are, of course, proxies for what really happens on the ground, and then the impacts on settlements and infrastructures, such as level of destruction of buildings and so on. So I'm going to talk about the experience in some of these, what has been done, and what actually we have to be able to do into the future, and how to do that. This is a really important aspect of the type of work we try to do. Yes, of course, here are recommendations on what ought to be done, but what can be done. So one of the big key features, of course, is the growth of population in the Caribbean, and I'll come back to that, both what's happening internally, but also from migration. By 2050, about 47 million, 38 in 2000. And as we look at some of this, there's also an aging distribution and just like me, as I age, I tend to get around the middle, and you could see that in terms of the distribution of the percent of total population, male and female, around the region. And really a large distribution of folks below 50. So it's a relatively young region. And so as we think through this, what is the current state of play in the region? Caribbean countries have inherent vulnerabilities, and you will have heard a lot about that, and water and other things like that. The magnitude and timing and location of impacts are difficult to predict, and I'm going to speak to some of that. I'm hoping Roxanne Stennett-Brown from UEMONA speaks more about the trends and so on later, but I do want to raise an issue about how well do we understand that magnitude, timing, and location. A changing climate changes weather unpredictably, predictably in some cases. As I like to tell people, I guarantee you next winter will be colder than next summer. That's a year from now. That's on average. But how, in fact, are the extremes going to change in those settings? And we know certainly for the Caribbean region, there are two impacts of things like El Nino and La Nina and so on. There's the increasing urbanization, and that actually factors into the age distribution and ability to respond to risk, the changing social dynamics, work-life patterns, lifestyle expectations, and then the disaster impacts that actually tend to set back or reverse development. And that latter bit is something that's really important. They don't have to be major hurricanes or major droughts, but sequences of smaller events actually create a constant everyday sense of responding to risk over time, so that when something big happens, the capabilities might not be there where we need them. So as we think through this, here are some of the things that have been put into place from a regional standpoint. And I've been involved in some of them, many others potentially in the call. Certainly the institutions I mentioned have been in the area of emergency management, construction, aviation, maritime, commerce. And the reports that have been in there, Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, the Caribbean 5 Cs, climate change adaptation, from the Red Cross, the vulnerability and capacity methodology. These are the things that have been put into place from about 1997, and I'll come back to that activity. It's important that we look at this because we treat risk not as a single discrete issue, but as an accumulated issue over time. How we build, where we build, how that develops over time, but also how we can do it and are doing it in some places very differently that reduces risk over time. So the notion of risk as an accumulated construct is extremely important, as opposed to, is it a hurricane, is it a drought, is it a flood, or is it a landslide? And one thing is we keep in mind as we're doing this is that these climate risks are not just about projections. They're variable. They cross multiple decades, sub-decades, when El Nino sudden oscillation events happen, months and weeks, days and hours, and these accumulate over time. And I want to keep this in mind because this determines whether or not the actions we take today and tomorrow can either constrain or enable long-term risk. So the long-run predictions, but also the risk assessments we do in our businesses, the seasonal forecasting, such as La Nina conditions and hurricanes, El Nino conditions and drought, all of these filter and accumulate over multiple timescales. There is not just a projection for 2100 or 2050, and what do we do about that? When you add these kinds of variabilities onto that, we get surprises in the system. We get something much larger than we expected. And a changing climate leads to changes in extreme climate events. We know that. That is a central part of the entire set of lectures. And one of the things I want to ask is, how well do we understand those extremes? And why this is important? It becomes extremely important in the sense of, do we know what the risks are? Well, we can list them. Sure, hurricanes of increasing intensity. Sure, droughts of increasing magnitude. In fact, as people know, the Caribbean is one of the most reliably drying places in the projections. But that's only the trends. The question is, what are the extremes from the standpoint of convective storms, of wildfires, extratropical cyclones, the issue of melting of ice caps and what that means to sea level rise. But when you have storms on top of sea level rise, the strength of waves. So that variability becomes extremely important and extremely complex to understand. So what is an extreme event? An extreme event is the climatology. What happens seasonally? Wet season, dry season. When we add the trend, you see the blue area begins to shift the probability. When we add the trend and the boundary conditions, and by boundary conditions, I mean the land, the ocean, the slowly varying aspects of our Earth system. And then what the weather does, which has a strong chaotic factor to it. An extreme is created by all of those things: the trend, the boundary conditions, the initial conditions, and the climatology. So an extreme is an extremely complex thing. It's not just what's a drought, how do I diagnose a drought? We all know onsets of drought are important, but even more important than the onset of a drought is whether it intensifies, because by then we have used up the water buffers in our system, the livestock, land degradation begins to occur. So I want us to keep this in mind, that when we are now going to talk about what is being done about these things, that the complexity of extremes, variability, and trends is what we're talking about when we talk about climate. When we add all of those together, you see the way in which the circulation of the atmosphere begins to move around the globe. And that makes it very difficult to predict when and where wet gets wetter and dry gets drier, where that really happens. When we add the thermodynamics of the CO2 increase and the circulation of the atmosphere, where those extremes go become difficult to predict, but we can know them. Now for the Caribbean, El Nino affects us, the North Atlantic Oscillation affects us, certainly the ITCZ, everybody in our region knows this. And when we put all of those together, we actually have these features that go from daily and seasonal to interannual to decades and longer. So those are the mechanisms of variability in the tropical Atlantic. And so this is to give us a sense that climate change is not just about the projections, but in fact is changes in our extremes that we're seeing right now, changes in variability that we don't fully understand yet, how climate change will affect ENSO, and then the long-term trends that you see in the projections. And I'll put up a couple of these figures just to give you a sense of what's happening in the region. There's the ocean heat content, there's the sea ice concentration that influences our sea level rise, warm waters fueling tropical storm formation. And if we look at 2020, hurricanes Dorian, Hannah, Laura, and Sally all rapidly intensified before making landfall. And most importantly, we're seeing them move more slowly. So I want us to keep this in mind. And that's just tropical storms, that's just hurricanes, not droughts, not other things just yet. that in fact, we're seeing them move a bit more slowly. And when they move slowly, they put more rain, winds last longer. So the damage is bigger than just whether or not the storm is a category 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. And it's important for us to know that when that Saffir-Simpson, and Bob Simpson knows somebody I knew, was developed, it was based on the infrastructure and buildings of Southern Florida. And we know in our region in the Caribbean, not all of our buildings are built that way. So the wind strength and the categories are based on the speed of the wind and the damage it can do. And so in a sense, it's the category of 1 to 5 is not fully representative of the impacts that can be done in the Caribbean region. In fact, we estimate that a 3% increase in wind speed actually increases damage by about 15%. And now we're seeing these storms moving slower, rapidly intensifying at different times. And that combination changes the nature of the storm itself. Wetter, stronger, slower moving, and therefore higher surges. So what does that mean? The first thing we respond with was insurance. The Caribbean Catastrophic Risk Insurance Facility, one of the most innovative things globally has been the CRIF. After Hurricane Ivan hit in 2004, the heads of government worked with the World Bank to say, okay, how do we get ahead of this? Now, this type of insurance is actually the first multi-country, multi-peril risk pool in the world. The first insurance instrument to develop parametric insurance policies for natural events, right? I don't like the phrase natural catastrophes, but that's the CRIF language, because a disaster is a combination of the natural hazard and our inability or ability to manage the risk. That combination leads to disasters or not, or catastrophes. And as we think through this, one of the things that NOAA, the place I work at, does is it helps through the National Hurricane Center take the wind speeds and ask at certain thresholds of wind speed, what damage might we expect? And that's how CRIF, certainly for hurricanes, does its payouts. And there's the members of 19 Caribbean governments, 3 Central American governments, 1 Caribbean electric utility. And this has become an extremely valuable way of managing risk. It does not pay out everything you lost. Neither does it pay out most of the things, but what it does is it pays out enough for countries to restart their businesses in the short term. And so when we had the devastating year of 2017, which I'll come back to, what we call a focusing event, something that changed the way we think about the things in the Caribbean, as I like to tell people, let's not talk about 2017 as a new normal. We don't know what the new normal is. And so this gives us a sense of how abnormal it could be. The payout were all made within 14 days, when Hurricane Irma and Maria did. This was extremely important because it gave people and communities and countries a chance to recover and restart some of their businesses, transportation, airports, ports, and so on, very quickly. This is an important innovation in the world of insurance, and it started in the Caribbean. And down on the right, I don't need to read out all of those. I'll make the slides available. It gives you a sense of what the payouts were used for. And 58% were immediate post-event activities, including assistance to affected people, repairs and recovery, and activities to support the country's return to normal operations. Extremely important, how to get ourselves back up on our feet as quickly as possible. This is one of the most innovative things in the world and started right in this region. But we know that climate change is now affecting some of the extremes we see. And as I like to tell people, we still can't say one extreme is affected solely by climate change, but we can certainly say that the categories are. In other words, if something is increasing by an inordinate amount, that little bit of extra has to be related to what's happening in the background climate. So the way we try to think of it is, if somebody is batting and he or she hits, in each inning hits about 5 sixes, but then next year they start hitting about 10 in each inning, something happened. It could be steroids, it could be something else. That is what climate change does. It adds, it does not create hurricanes, droughts, and floods, but it exacerbates their conditions. So the strategy in the region, developed by the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Authority, and including one of the most innovative people that you'll meet, Elizabeth Riley, who directs this center, developed this results-based strategy and programming framework that was started to be implemented on linking disaster risk reduction to climate change adaptation. the strong indicators between sustainable development and the climate indicators. But as I mentioned before, something happened in 2017 that basically overwhelmed many parts of the region. Hurricane Maria, Hurricane Irma, 22 of 29 Caribbean SIDS were impacted. 4 were affected by 1 storm, 13 by 2 storms, 5 by 3 storms. This was, at the time, the largest year of insurance losses around the world. So in the Caribbean, but elsewhere. 2020, we saw even more hurricanes than 2017, but 2017, a lot of places were hit more than once. And one of those places was Puerto Rico. And we saw some of what I'm about to say, we saw some of this year with Hurricane Fiona. Hurricane Maria, you can see on the top as it covered most of Puerto Rico. You can see where the wind speed increased because of high elevation flooding and high elevation disruption of due to topographic factors. But the most important thing was that it took about 3 months, 3 to 4 months for water, cell coverage, electricity, and medical services to be recovered. This was the most critical and devastating impact. The networks that actually people rely on, and this is why CRIF is so important, the critical system failures caused evacuations, closures, and extensive reduction in services long after the event. And strangely enough, we have hurricanes, but in most island environments, people identify freshwater as the issue that is a critical factor. So I want to keep in mind that, yes, we think of the Caribbean as a place that is vulnerable, at risk rather, to hurricanes. And yet one of the biggest things at risk is our water supply. So there's a dichotomy there at the 2 ends of the extremes, too much and too little. So I want to keep this in mind, that it is these networks and cascading risks that are actually what we're trying to deal with. So 2013 to 2016, the Caribbean multi-year drought, the most severe and extensive since 1950, certainly influenced by ENSO, and also temperature-driven increases in evaporative demand. And the work done by UE, Mona, and elsewhere basically showed that this drying of the region during a period in which places like Jamaica uses 10 times its annual input from rainfall, so using up groundwater, is not just unfamiliar, it is unprecedented. So let's keep those 2 extremes in mind, that what we're dealing with is not one trying to respond to hurricanes alone, but a continuum of risks from drought to storms and floods. There's also something else that happens in our region, what we call systemic risk. You saw the cascading risks in Puerto Rico. The region imports a lot of food. If you see the orange areas as exports and the green as imports, you can see what I mean by that dot over the Caribbean. The region is also highly dependent on inputs of people from other parts of the world. I always like to ask people what's the percent of tourism in the Caribbean, of the world tourism that the Caribbean supports? Everybody comes up with a large number. It's only about 4%. So whenever something happens in other parts of the world affecting travel, and it could be any type of thing, or other markets opening up, the Caribbean is instantly affected. Heavy imports of fuel, large dependent on food imports, as I just mentioned, a lot of migration from Central America through the Caribbean and from Northern South America, a lot of migration within the region as a result of jobs, disasters, safety, and long-standing impacts from the years in which development was taking place in the type of crops since around the 1860s or so, why we build on one side, the type of crops we have, and then more recently, a report we did with the Economic Commission for Latin America and the UNDR regional office on how COVID actually disrupted the region's capabilities to manage both disasters and climate change. And this, of course, affected the remittances that we get into the region. In some places, it's anywhere from 10 to 20% of the economy. So these surprises matter. And when we talk about dealing with risk, it is about risk reduction, not simply reducing the risk for responding to climate change, but the other things that can actually help undermine our ability to respond to a changing world. So there's simple risks, complicated risks, and the world that we're in, complex, compounding, and cascading risks, and island environments face them more than any other places. These systemic risks, the local imbalances, Global and regional network disruptions, as I just pointed out, are overwhelming our traditional climate risk management approaches. One hazard at a time, operational capabilities, but the networks in which we operate are the things that are vulnerable. So what we'll talk about, we started on trying to understand the network, the nature and comprehensive aspects of risks. The dialogue, the coordination, we'll talk about in a little bit, and then talk about how the region has been enhancing action and support for finance, technology, and capacity building. So here's our region. The first, one of the earliest things that was done was called the Global Framework for Climate Services, the Caribbean implementation. Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology, the CARICOM Climate Change Center, launched in 2013 as part of this, the global framework implementation in the Caribbean region. And I'll talk a little bit about what that means and how well it operated and how well it has done. This became a very, very central effort globally. I co-chair the Climate Service Information Development for the World Meteorological Organization. The most innovative and creative of these efforts is actually being done by the Caribbean Institute for Meteorology and Hydrology. And what they do is get the information for planning into communities, working through the national Met services and hydro services, into disaster risk reduction, water and food security. Actually, when the 2013 to 2016 drought occurred, the lessons that were developed actually helped reduce the risk that happened in 2013, 2016. And I'll mention something on the warnings that actually helped save lives during 2017. So some things are happening. And in fact, this was recognized by the Caribbean Council for Trade and Economic Development, who actually endorsed the development of climate services for the region, providing information to help us manage risks and resilience. One of the things that this is moving towards is being able to map and assess multi-hazard warning systems. Some of you may have heard the Secretary General of the UN mention earlier this year in March that he's pushing to have the entire world and countries which are missing them right now to be covered by early warning systems. But these systems, as he points out and has been developed, have to be multi-hazard, as I was just mentioning. We're stretching from droughts to floods and even earthquakes. CIMH developed Caribbean multi-hazard early warning system because hazard events might occur alone, but more and more we're seeing them simultaneous, cascading, and cumulative over time. And in fact, if you were to take account of the losses, economic losses, you won't see islands very much, or if you see the total population, of course, we're small. But when you look at the number of hazards per unit area, 19 of the 20 most vulnerable countries in the world are islands, and 10 of those are in the Caribbean. When you couple hydrometeorological, climate, geological, and marine. And of course, we have to remember, no island is the same. Caribbean islands are dynamic, multifaceted environments. One experiment that occurred was actually during the August of 2021, when Hurricane Grace was about to hit Haiti after Haiti had experienced an earthquake. That combination actually forecasted by CIMH led to the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management, Haitian officials, and Regional Red Cross and others being very much aware and getting ready. And it actually saved lives in Haiti during this time as a result of that combination. One example of a tropical storm and an earthquake almost simultaneously. And then some of you will remember La Soufrière exploding. And one of the biggest impacts from St. Vincent was certainly the ash around the region. But there was also an impact on some of the things we're using for adaptation. The ash covered a lot of the photovoltaic production in Barbados, actually disrupting operations from solar power for quite a few days. So we're seeing these not only multiple hazards in the same place, but then hazards that are spatially distributed. So this gives us a sense that temporal hazards matter and spatial hazards. There's the plume coming out of St. Vincent. And as you can see, it spreads over Barbados, and that ash coverage actually took quite some time to clear up and then to restart the PV systems. So this leads us to the question of coordination. What do we do across these multiple time and space scales? And communication is important, but communication is not enough. See, as the doctor is telling the orderlies, I communicated before, but you also have to coordinate when we lift on 3. And those 3, in our case, are the climate change adaptation, sustainable development goals, disaster risk reduction. And if they are not aligned and coordinated, we will not be reducing vulnerability and enhancing resilience. We will be doing it piecemeal, and as a result, creating new risks into the future. One of these efforts is the early warning information system across climate timescales. When the World Climate Conference happened in 2009, that launched the global framework on climate services, David Farrell from CIMH, myself, many others decided, look, we have to treat these things as cross timescales. Led by David, with support from the US State Department and many others, and the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Authority, they developed the early warning information systems across climate timescales, a regional consortium of the public health, energy, SIDS, CIMH, on integrated products for monitoring outlooks and regional bulletins. This consortium is a key regional mechanism that champions the design and development of tailored products and services. And it was very clear during 2017 and the seasons, the drought and hurricane seasons afterwards, the ways in which this collaboration and coordination actually helped stave off food insecurity and save lives. This regional consortium is coordinated by CIMH and SIDEMA, but is very much geared towards how national departments and communities respond. So this is one of the great successes in thinking about climate across timescales, not just the projections, but also the types of data, information, and so on that the Red Cross uses, the folks dealing with food security, the folks dealing with, up on the top you see CCRE, which is the renewable energies component. And so this has become a really important way in which the Caribbean region is coordinating across islands to leverage each other's capabilities. Another activity that started around 2004 was the Caribbean Regional Climate Change Center, 5Cs. It was realized that piecemeal project by project approaches would not provide the same impact as a long-term strategic approach. So a coordinated effort on funding that was coming into the region or being put up by countries in the region needed to be aligned in terms of its goals and practices. And so there are 5 objectives of the 5Cs moving forward: scaling up actions to manage the effects of climate change, strengthening strategic partnerships, increasing the uptake of climate change data, and increasing the public's ability to make informed decisions. As I just mentioned, UESAC plays a major role there. And then understanding that awareness in the region is critical. The need for taking these multiple timescale, multiple space approach. And so the Caribbean Program for Adaptation to Climate Change, the mainstreaming adaptation to climate change, special projects were all undertaken from 1997 to 2012. And you can see under there the types of efforts that were taken. This laid the base for getting at studies and programs on resilience in the region. So we see the risk piece on how we adapt and adjust to near-term events in a coordinated way. The 5C's role was to help coordinate the program funding and efforts that were leading to resilience. And we worked with them on several of these. So I want to keep this in mind. And one of the major things that came out of this was a set of activities and projects with different communities on assessing vulnerability and capacity. The photovoltaic systems in Belize, they basically leverage funding from UK DFID and so on to do ecosystem-based adaptation, input of sea level rise monitoring stations with NOAA and others' help. So these capabilities were funded and supported over time, forming a base for action. So you're not just responding effort by project. So priority 1 for the 5Cs into the now, one is integrating climate change work into sustainable development. These pictures are actually from projects that are being undertaken. These are not just, taken off the web somewhere. These are efforts that the 5Cs have been engaged in to promote systems and actions to reduce vulnerability, promoting measures to derive benefits, and promoting actions and arrangements to reduce GHGs, and then implementation of specific adaptation options. On the top right, you'll see accreditation master agreement. The 5Cs has been accredited since 2015 as a partner and eligible for support under the Green Climate Fund. I put this up just to give a sense that there's a coordinated approach happening, and I'll mention some of the efforts that are undertaken, but the need for scaling up is still there. Whether it's all of the efforts I'm showing in the region, how we move beyond the projects to in fact get to a coordinated regional approach to resilience. One of the things that's been done out of 5Cs over the years was the solar powered reverse osmosis system, very small, but on a very dry island on Beckway, and then one on Grenada. This has been put into place over the last 5 years or so. In addition, working with NOAA and others on the light detection and ranging, digital elevation model, I worked with them on some of that. The studies contracted by 5Cs to begin to understand and develop a geospatial inventory of where the critical coastal infrastructure are. And you see some of that for 28 countries being done. But there are also these informal settlements in the region that have not been as well mapped as they should be. So there's that mix for goal 11 of the SDGs on sustainable cities and communities. Some additional efforts I'll point to are in Trinidad, Grenada, Barbados, Dominica, and Montserrat. And Barbados, of course, has been leading the way on the notion of ridges to reefs, energy, water, and waste, gullies and wetlands, and a whole lot of activities surrounding recycling. Solar photovoltaics, which I mentioned. In Grenada, there's a lot of activities going on with Nature Conservancy on developing new capabilities and cutting edge technology for regrowing reefs under stress. In Trinidad, there's an effort by the Vetiver Group, Vetiver TT, on regrowing and revegetating sloped lands, and some of this is being exported to other islands, and creating local products from the vetiver grass. Places like Montserrat, very close look at what is being done on goal 14 on sustaining life below water, capacity development and strengthening partnerships, and financing those for fisheries and economic growth. And one of the best experiments, again, globally, that came out of 2017, a focusing event, was Dominica creating the Climate Resilience Execution Agency. This is the first major effort in the region to be climate proof. No one can be completely climate proof. So the country, I was just in Dominica last week, is developing its efforts around a set of key activities that we've known for years need to be put into place. Social safety nets, community emergency readiness initiative, innovative approaches to insurance, and then the Center of Excellence for Data and Resilience Decision Making. This effort is actually one that tries to get at the temporal and spatial aspects of risk from the standpoint of resilience, how not to let their networks fail, not just building by building. It's a really amazing set of work that the people in Dominica have been doing on natural assets, on institutions, on community economy and infrastructure. So we've assessed the risks. Are we done? There's Winston Duke, he's both from Trinidad, well, from Tobago, Trinidad and Tobago, the place I'm from, and from Wakanda. We're not done. Even though we know all of this, we have to move from diagnostics to implementation, linking economies, communities, environment, and then putting all of those pieces together. A lot is being done, as you can see. So there's a lot of capabilities exist in the region. So we ask the question, how best can we guide investments to strengthen social, environmental, and economic risk reduction? So systemic risk governance and early warning, if we had to ask that question, we need to know, where do we target to get to disaster and climate resilient communities? We need to have broad-based awareness of vulnerability issues, technical capacity, presence of up-to-date risk profile, appropriate institutional arrangements, communities are mobilized, and budgetary and alignment and support, and political will and buy-in. The one at the top is the most important. Now, the reason why I put this up is not to say, here's the idealized thing of what we need, but to say, here are the outcomes we're after. Anything that we're doing has to meet these 7 outcomes that are developed by SIDS and others. So this is not an idealized thing. It is, how do we use the research institutions, the governance, financial institutions, project implementation, advocacy and knowledge sharing to make sure that these are the goals, economy, environment, and equity that are being met. So these are the outcomes that we're after. And to do this, we need to navigate not just for some imagined changed future, but through a changing climate, as I point out, to move beyond hazard by hazard approaches to manage risks as cumulative from the short term to the long term. But it means that we need to look at the projections more carefully than we have been, since a lot for small island environments in particular, the variability, the changes, and the extremes are already affecting us. We're vulnerable long before 1.5. Another is to advance the governance of risk knowledge and to broaden those actor networks vertically and horizontally. National subunits, you can see them on the left, ensure political authority and coherence, develop a culture, two-way partnership, decentralize, and understand that co-production of knowledge is not just about give me your data and we'll do something together, but we share the risks and responsibilities. And the UESACs and so on is actually very much along these lines. Understanding that it's not static. It's awareness, assessment, planning, implementation, monitoring, and evaluation, and then again, going around that cycle in time. Develop a cadre and critical mass of within region science and services professional. UE, Cave Hill has been doing just that since 2003. Developing now, we have 120 people in the region. They bring local voices, local data. They bring the analyses, address user needs, develop applications, and engage in the Caribbean Regional Outlook Forum. And the people who actually led and created this, I taught in this program, but the people behind it are Leonard Nurse, Nita Salaya, and Neville Trotz. And the last thing, how do we finance adaptive risk government? How do we move from pledges to implementation? We have a lot of pledges, and we'll see more in the COP coming up. Creating a marketplace for financing requires that we get it defragmented. So we're not just funding adaptation pilots. As I like to say, we have a lot of pilots and not enough planes, and CREAD is leading that way. So there's the need for an establishment of a regional coordination mechanism for aligning this financing. And we're going to try to do that over the next year or so by taking a new view of assessment. What is being done in not just diagnosing the risk, but what is being done in implementation across regional, local, and national capabilities on tipping points, multiple stresses, and so on. One of the things I did want to put up is the Vice President. Vice President Harris has actually launched the US Caribbean Partnership, and there's support and efforts through this collaboratively between the US and the Caribbean to finance and work on specific region needs for early warning and disaster risk reduction. And I can speak to this more if we need. And then we're actively engaging in the region on citizen science and citizen monitoring, and I'll come back to some of those. So my last slide is this. We have many countries in the region. We have many changes occurring, from hazards to ecological exposure that cascade. We have, through UESACs and others, and we need to scale these up, integrated information in which monitoring impacts, planning, and communication moves ahead together. But we do need a strong regional coordination to move from the theory of change, which is great to have, idealized, good academic exercise, to a practice of change, enabling and sustaining the collaborative networks across research, observation, services, and decision-making. There's a lot of great history of physical, social, and decision-making research that can help make this happen. So these are many of the institutions we work with, some of the work that you've seen that we actually work with, but credit must be given to the people who occupy these institutions and make them live up to their goals. So thank you.
Thank you, Roger, for your presentation. I would like to invite persons who have questions for Roger to either type those questions in the chat.
Masha, I'd like answers. I'm not looking for more questions.
You want answers, not questions? Yeah, so please feel free to either type those questions in the chat or talk or ask those questions directly to Roger. Roger, I just wanted to say that one of the things you mentioned, and I know from having lived in the Caribbean that is so important, is coordination among Caribbean countries and communication. And you find that one of the first things, that set of things that fail during like a storm, hurricane, etc., is usually your telecommunications and then your transportation infrastructure. So how is this challenge, based on your work in the Caribbean, how do you see this challenge being integrated or addressed in mitigation planning?
So from a risk mitigation standpoint now, things like UESACs and so on that I mentioned, the early warning system across climate timescales, a big part of the reporting that SIDS and others are trying to do under that is actually really to get, cell phone connections, make sure that they're working immediately after. Now, the reason why I mentioned CRIF is the idea is how to recover some key functional services, as I mentioned in Puerto Rico. And that's actually a role that the CRIF funding plays in order to try to get those up. Now, one of the things, as I mentioned, we can't be divorced from our history, right? Why we develop in the places we do, so many of our coastal cities and so on are right on the water. So many of our transportation networks are right on the edge. That's a product of history. And it's a product of development over time. And what we're trying to do, certainly through the many efforts that you're seeing, through the vulnerability and capacity assessments and so on, is to basically show that your services break down when those things break down. And now there's a lot of efforts, not on just physical investments on revetments and structure for shoring up, nearshore roads and so on, but actually an increasing awareness of the role of nature-based solutions that play a role in moving roads and so on a little bit further inside, and then rebuilding mangroves and things like that on the outside. So there is that increasing awareness, and in fact, Dominica Creed is taking on that very, very seriously. The question is scaling up. So I want to, there's an issue with what we're saying. Everything we're saying, we know we ought to be doing. So to reduce vulnerability. And one of my mentors, it was Gilbert White, just always ask the question: if we know so much, why aren't we doing better? And the issue is this: from the standpoint of knowing, it's really one of scaling up to the island level as opposed to just projects. I did a study in X or Y, and I've showed that erosion is happening here. It's okay. So what does it mean to have regional and national awareness about those risks and people's day-to-day roles in responding to them? So I want to be clear that without that policy and coherence aspect, none of this happens over the long term. We'll have projects, but they don't get sustained. The issue is this: everything I mentioned, we know we ought to be doing. One of the big things is that we're doing a lot of it, but the rates of change are overwhelming the rate at which we're doing it. So our issue is how fast and the scale spatially of which we're doing it. So yeah, there is awareness. I'm not, no, as with here, Hurricane Ian and everything else, yes. So I don't want us to be lost in the knowledge deficit aspects that, we don't know enough. People don't know they're at risk. Well, that's just not true. The issue is, as we rebuild, as we do new investments, ensuring that they meet those goals that I mentioned in the circles is where the new support and funding is going. So scaling up spatially, but also at a rate that is aware of the rate at which the background change is occurring. So, and I showed some examples in which people are doing that.
Okay, yeah, thank you. I see somebody has his hand up, or their hand up.
Yeah, may I?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Hello, everyone. It's Quân from Institute for Circular Economy Development, Vietnam National University, Ho Chi Minh Cities. Yeah, thank you very much for great presentations. I find it's really interesting, and also I think this also we learn a lot also for our case in Vietnam. We have very elongated coastal line, but also several islands. Actually, recently we carry a project regarding developing circularity plan related to circular economy for an island in southern Vietnam. And and we found that by a little number of challenges, and especially when we are talking about from piloting to upscaling, and because I think you already talked a lot about that, and I think it's really interesting for us to learn more, especially when we looking at a kind of what could be possible business models. Of course, here we try to have like circular business model, because we see quite, for example, the tourism industry is quite vulnerable, especially from the COVID and also some disaster. Yeah, so we are in terms of circular economy, and we are now thinking about evaluating different ecosystem or ecological values including carbon storage and some others, and which is we really think that it could be possible business models to support those country islands. So I'm just wondering how those things is happening now in Caribbean island and also maybe global scale, and how you see this potentiality to have and support those island sustainability. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the question. Extremely important, and I think there's a lot we can learn from Vietnam as well. So one of the things, so I was the convening lead author in the 5th assessment report for adaptation, planning, and implementation. And most of the things we had were on planning, not on implementation at the time. And as you're noting, and as I pointed out, there's a lot going on project by project on implementation. I didn't put up a lot on the circular economy approaches, which are being undertaken, but the reason why I didn't was not to give the impression, oh, we solved this, we have the circular economy. The difficulties of implementing that and getting the financing behind it is extremely critical, because the payoffs for a lot of nature-based solutions are in the long term. And what we're trying to do with the private sector is basically help make the case with governments and donors for nature-based solutions. To be brutally honest with you, we looked at in the Global Assessment Report 2022 for the UNDRR on where we could find private investments in long-term nature-based solutions, couldn't find any. And so the issue is the partnership, because we have to understand the private sector wants, needs, and their model is a near-term return. So what we're trying to do is get civil society, the public, and the private sectors together to ask, how do we work together to make the case for the long term that underwrites many of the private sector activities in the near term? So I don't want us to be too, I really appreciate the way you framed it, because I don't want us to go, oh, need the private sector. And I'm like, let's be clear on the role and what they do and how we can work together with them. So the circular economy approach is being advocated and undertaken. What I wanted to show the legs on which the circular economy approach is standing, but also then to make the case that if we don't defragment the financing, we won't have enough to do the models that you suggested. And that's why I put up that thing on the notion that much of the support that we see is not aligned very well towards getting at the different parts of the circular economy. So yes, extremely important. Understanding what those roles are needs more research and nuance for really what the role of the private sector, the civil societies who hold their feet on the equity issues. But the long-term sustainability and services are governments, local and local communities. So I just want to make sure that the research that we're doing, and you know all of this, of course, that is focused on those things, making them work, as opposed to assuming that, okay, government doesn't have enough money, the private sector will pay for it. Well, they're looking for a block grant from the government. So I want to be honest that we have to work out where and how that mix plays a role. And in the I think the circular economy approach is the one we're going to end up moving towards globally. My question is, are we doing that rapidly enough given the background rates of change? And the way you described it, I think is really, to me, forward-looking. So I think there is an opportunity through these mechanisms for us to maybe do some peer-to-peer learning more deliberately. So that's a comment that's fully appreciated. I just hope that we have to make sure we're doing it at a rate that is commensurate with what is the rate at which things are changing. So
yeah, thank you so much. Thank you.
Yeah, come on.
Yeah.
Hi there, you still there?
Oh, Roger,
Greetings.
if I can just add to some of the things you've been saying about things going on in the Caribbean, and I, as you will know,
Who is this?
It's Adrian Cashman.
I know. I wanted you to introduce yourself to everyone.
There are a couple of things that we've been doing in the water sector in the Caribbean, which you have been remiss on not mentioning.
Well, you gave a talk on water, Adrian, didn't you? Why would I repeat what you're saying? That's sort of a.
Oh, that's coming up, my friend.
That's
That's
a
coming.
that's a misdirection, Adrian. Why would I talk about what you're going to talk about?
That's coming up, Roger. No, one
Okay.
of the building on some of the things, the
Yeah.
coordination that you've been talking about, and some of
Yep.
the other interventions. For example, with the assistance of the Inter-American Development Bank, the region has developed its regional strategic action plan for water responding to climate change. And we've actually got a monitoring committee going under the Caribbean Water and Wastewater Association, which is, as you know, also a partner in the climate services area, which tries to bring together all the main actors in the water sector, looking at the projects they're doing. They report on a regular basis to each other,
Right.
On what projects there are, where the projects are going. The main reason for that being to try and avoid duplication, to share best practice and experiences. So that's another leg, if you like, in the coordination mechanisms that there are in the region. The other one, which is very, very new, is QUIC, which is the Caribbean Water Utilities Insurance Collective, which is providing also parametric insurance to water utilities in the event of disasters. And that is also being hosted and administered through CRIF. That is just getting going. Seed funding has been announced, and we're still in the process of developing that. But I do want to raise, I would start to disagree with you in one area, an area that is of emerging concern to myself, and that is in the area of capacity building. What I'm seeing, and maybe it's just my own very short-sighted perspective, is there's a lot of interest in young professionals, people coming out of university in climate change, but what I'm not seeing is, particularly in the water sector, we're not seeing the same level of interest amongst people coming out of university to enter into the water sector, to looking at the intersection of climate and water, the provision of water services, the management of water resources. And this is something that is of emerging concern to me. I'm not sure if I'm looking at an anomaly on that. So I worry about it, because whilst we may be developing people who can deal with, who look at climate and climate science and climate policies and investment, that if we don't have the specific knowledge of that intersection driven by the science of water, then we might not be optimizing the interventions, whether it's in long-term climate change adaptation, mitigation, or even to disaster risk management affecting the water industry. One last point I would make, and it's just
you got to give me some time to respond here, Adrian.
Yeah. What I would just like, this is just an observation again, water infrastructure is vulnerable, not necessarily of itself, but it's vulnerable because it depends on other services, such as power.
Network approach. That's the network.
The networking aspect of that is important. Okay, over to you now.
Yeah, no, thanks. Given the time, I do want to. Great to hear from you. One, given, I mean, I know both of those issues you raised, but what I did was go through the speakers. I didn't like spend a long time on the trends in climate, because I expect Roxanne to do that. I expect you to do water. But I think there's a bigger issue than just water here, right? Which is, when I say develop a cadre and critical mass of within region science and services professionals, I'm not necessarily asking for them to be trained in climate. I'm asking them to be trained in network building, in sustaining the activities that bring users of information to bear with a changing environment. Could be climate, right? So the issue is really where those transdisciplinary people are being created. So I'm with you on that capacity, but I think it's more than water. It's in water, energy, and food. as a first three that's needed, where those sort of network and bridge builders are supposed to be. So now from my standpoint, we need also not to just make it an issue. Is it water? Is it energy? Is it food? And above that, is it climate? No, it's actually how we build and sustain networks, and we're not really training people to do that. We have engineers to deal with infrastructure, to think about infrastructure, but in fact, what you just pointed out, which is absolutely the case, which I don't find to be a disagreement at all, is how we're bringing and training people to work on the issue of networks and the norms under which those networks operate. So I don't find that to be a disagreement, because the idea here is not starting from climate and going down. It's starting from people's vulnerability, applications, and networks up. And that's the point we were making. The other thing, of course, that's the training piece of it. A large part of scaling up and coordination, that's not the kind of things we fund. So I would say, yes, we need to train them. As you know, we're always struggling to pay for the fellowships for these people. We're not scaling up the funding for people to work on that interface. And yet that's what's needed with emerging risks. So I do want to make that point. The reason why I mentioned CRIF in the context of hurricanes and a little later drought, but not water, was one I expected that to be mentioned later, but also to point to the fact of the innovation of parametric insurance in this highly uncertain area. So that's basically the 2 points. But I couldn't agree with you more, but I don't agree that, that's somehow a gap in what I was saying. We're saying that there's a cadre and critical mass of within region sciences and services professional. Science is not just climate. And so the interface is really that of building the networks that sustain the capabilities. That's even richer than training people in water or food or energy. So.
Thank you. And thank you, Adrian, for your question. And I tried introducing you, but I was muted and I didn't realize that, Adrian. Anyhow.
Those were two great questions. I mean, that opened up, both questions opened up a great avenues for discussion.